Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Doc Candelaria. I just want to say that I am grateful for this invitation to speak to our graduate students because it's really important what the effort of the graduate program office is doing to allow you to interact with one another as you are working on your graduate degree. No? So I'm really glad to have been invited. No? And I didn't even know I was the first speaker. But anyway, so the topic that I propose to speak about as you know, is called the Ignatian way of proceeding in research. No? And some of you may be wondering, why did I propose this topic? No? And of course, the reason is that we belong to a Jesuit university, and it's important for us to just reflect about how the work we're doing relates to the spirituality, the worldview that the Jesuit University, the Ateneo de Manila, is really promoting among our students. No? As you know, in Ateneo, aside from academics, formation itself is just as important, if not even more important. No? So I thought maybe it would be good to have a conversation with the graduate students just to hear what you think about some of the ideas I'd like to share with you about an Ignatian approach to research. Research is a very important part of our studies, especially on the graduate and doctoral level. So I think it's important that we spend some time talking about this. No? Now, what do I mean by Ignatian? No? Sometimes when we think about Ignatian, what do we mean by an Ignatian approach to research? There are really three senses, I think, that we can think about when we talk about an Ignatian way of proceeding in research. The first is as far as topic is concerned. If the topic is related to spirituality, religion, Ignatian spirituality, or values, then that would be Ignatian. No? Or the other one would be the purpose of the research. If the purpose of the research is, hopefully all of you are thinking about, is to help make the world a better place, then that's already Ignatian. No? But my talk will not focus on those two because I think we already know more or less what it means to have an Ignatian topic or to have an Ignatian purpose. No? And I'm hoping that all our research is driven by the purpose of making the world a better place in some way. So that's already Ignatian. I'm really talking about the third sense, the third sense of the word Ignatian as far as research is concerned. And I'm talking about the worldview. No? What is the worldview of the researcher as the researcher is investigating a phenomenon, whether this phenomenon is something physical or natural, or whether this is something social? So I'd like to stop here for a while and just ask our moderator to show us the results of the poll. No? The poll really sort of tried to check whether, just to let me know where you are at this point, in your thesis, if you've even started it. So perhaps we can share the results. May I request the moderator to do that? Okay, so I think we can see the results. No? So, well, a majority of you, 83%, have not submitted any proposal. So that's a good thing because that means that you'll be able to think about the ideas even before you do that. No? Some of you have already submitted. That's fine. No? So in a way, I guess for those of you who are already in the middle of your thesis work, whether you're working on your lit review or whether you're in the middle of your writing, or even if you've already submitted your thesis, I hope I will be able to offer some food for thought as far as your thesis is concerned. Maybe you can evaluate in terms of your thesis, how Ignatian it is, no? Or you can also allow some of the ideas here to guide you as you're doing your lit review and the other aspects of thesis writing. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to focus on worldview. What do I mean by the worldview? No? What is this worldview? Bakit kailangang pag-usapan pang worldview sa research? No? And I'd like to focus on this particular slide. No? When I talk about the worldview, I'm really talking about the meta theory. No? And literally, what the meta theory is, it's the theory about our theories. No? It is the underlying assumptions that we have that sort of make the theory intelligible. No? As you know, if you're doing research, you always have a theoretical framework. But often there are many implicit assumptions about your theoretical framework. And it's very important for our grad students to be critical, to interrogate even those assumptions. And what are these assumptions? Basically, they're assumptions about reality and about knowing. So medyo konting philosophical ng konti, but it's very important for us to be conscious and explicit about our assumptions about reality and knowing, our assumptions or our meta theory, because otherwise our research method might be all over the place. No, I hope that will clarify as I go along. But let me go on. No, obviously in a research work, the researcher, you investigate a phenomenon. And the phenomenon can be physical, no, like maybe it can be about a black hole or some cell, no, or it can be something social, like education, poverty, or whatever, no. So whether the phenomenon is physical or natural, or whether it is social, basically the task of the researcher is to investigate, to study, to understand, to learn about the phenomenon. Now, when we talk about investigating a phenomenon, there are underlying assumptions about reality. Because before you can even talk about something as a real phenomenon, you must be clear about what philosophers call their ontology. What are their assumptions about reality? In short, para sa iyo, ano ba mga totoo? What's real for you? No? And your assumptions will really affect your research. And if you're not conscious about your assumptions, you might be a little bit confused in terms of your actual investigation. At the same time, when you're investigating a phenomenon, no, obviously your epistemology or your assumptions about knowing that reality also make a difference. No? If you're confused about your epistemology, if you're not clear about your assumptions about what's possible for you to know, no, and what you mean by knowing, then I think again the research work you're doing might be flawed. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about worldview. What are our unconscious assumptions about reality, and what are our unconscious assumptions about knowing? Now, actually, many research work and many theses and dissertations are not explicit about their ontology and their epistemology. But the problem there is, even if you don't talk about ontology, kasi hindi usong ontology, no? In fact, there's a commandment starting with the modern philosophers that thou shalt not commit ontology. Huwag mo na pag-usapan ng metaphysics, no? Let's just focus on science, parang ganon, di ba? But the problem is, according to Roy Bhaskar, a critical realist, no, we always have an implicit ontology. No? It's possible that you're not conscious about your assumptions about reality, about your assumptions about knowing, no? But you do have assumptions. No? So if you're not explicit about them, if you're not conscious about them, you might end up being inconsistent with them. No? You might be making claims that are inconsistent with your beliefs about knowing, your beliefs about reality. Okay? So let me just draw your attention to this particular slide. No? So if your meta theory is explicit and clear, then there will be greater consistency and alignment across the different elements of your research work. No? So for example, as I said, meta theory has something to do with your ontology or your assumptions about reality. Meta theory is also related to your epistemology, your assumptions about knowing what is possible for us to know and how do we know, how do we investigate, diba? Now, the methodologies, your design for the methodology, how you will study and know your object of investigation is going to be affected by your meta theory. No? At the same time, your theoretical framework and your research question, like which phenomenon is real and is a legitimate object of investigation, that also depends on your meta theory. No? So kailangan may consistency yan, dapat may alignment yan. But the only way we can have consistency and alignment is if our meta theory, our ontology and epistemology are explicit and clear to us. Okay? So let me just, I'm going to focus on social science research, but a lot of these principles really are also applied to natural science, to the natural sciences and the other disciplines. No? So let's break down what a research is, no? Whether it's social science or natural science or whatever other discipline. A very common definition and easy to understand would be that research is basically systematically gathering, analyzing, and interpreting information for whatever purpose, for social, economic, educational, political, or scientific purpose. No? So the key words here are systematic. It has to be a systematic way. Kaya very, very rigorous tayo in terms of how we go about our thesis, diba? That we have to have a research question, we have to have methodologies and so on and so forth, a lit review. So systematic dapat lahat yan. But the most important part, the core of research is gathering, analyzing, interpreting information. Okay? Now the problem is, if you are not clear about what your assumptions about reality and what your assumptions are about knowing, magkakagulo tayo ng konti. So for example, what research entails? Basically, you have data or evidences at the bottom right there, no? And then you have theory or explanation. For me, one simple way of summarizing what a researcher is supposed to do is basically to theorize about data, no? And by theorize, I mean we describe and explain the phenomenon, no? And at the same time, the data and evidence that we gather will either confirm or revise the theory that we have, diba? So usually we have your advisor or supervisor will say, kailangan meron kang theoretical framework, no? At least an initial theoretical framework that can either be confirmed by your data or revised by your data, no? So parang ganun yun. So basically what you're doing is you're not just gathering data. That's only the means, no? The real purpose of research is theorizing about the data, describing and explaining data, no? Now, I just want to make a point here that sometimes our thesis is an empirical project, sometimes it's a philosophical project, no? So if it's an empirical project, we are theorizing about data, but if it's a philosophical project, we're theorizing about ideas, no? But it's the same, no? We always begin with a theoretical framework, no? And what we do is we hope the theoretical framework will either be confirmed or revised when we try to make an account of our data, okay? So now this is the problem. The problem is, as you can see, there's a gap between data and theory, no? Because data or evidence do not explain themselves, no? The job of the researcher is precisely to analyze and interpret the data so that a theory can emerge, no? So that the researcher can come up with an explanation. Now, the problem is for a researcher to analyze data, for a researcher to interpret data, to make sense of data, doon pumapasok yung mga assumptions natin about reality and knowing. So kung medyo confused tayo sa ating mga ontology and epistemology, baka kung ano-ano mangyari sa analysis and interpretation natin. Now, this diagram might be helpful, no? So first, data, no? So we gather data, we're observing, no? Whether you're observing physically, visually, or you're conducting a survey, whatever, no? And then you have to concept, because when you're trying to describe or define your data, no, you need concepts, and your concepts depend on your meta theory, no? Kung para sa iyo hindi, halimbawa, if for you non-material things are not real, then obviously your concepts will be limited to material concepts, di ba? So importante naka-align yan. And your theory, which is what you come up with when you're explaining your data, no? Again, is also aligned to your meta theory or your ontology and your epistemology. So basically, that's the big picture of what I'm going to try to talk to you about. Introduction pa lang tayo, no? So basically, ang importante, when we say an Ignatian approach to research, I'm not talking about topic, no? You don't have to come up with a religious or spiritual or values-related topic for your thesis or your research work to be Ignatian in approach, no? Number two, purpose, no? Hopefully, all our research is really driven towards the goal of helping other people, of making the world a better place. So Ignatian na yun, no? So medyo no-brainer yung dalawa, di ba? But I'm really asking you and challenging you to examine your assumptions about reality. Maybe you've never thought about it before unless you've been through a philosophy class. And also to examine your assumptions about knowing, no? Because research is about knowing reality more, no? So kung hindi malinaw sa iyo kung anong reality para sa iyo, hindi malinaw para sa iyo kung ano yung investigation, what investigation entails, then your data will be interpreted and analyzed in an inconsistent way, and your concept and theory will be all over the place. Okay? So that's the first big idea. The first big idea is we have to make sure that every element of our research, whether it's lit review, whether it's data analysis, whether it's methodology, whether it's an interpretation of our findings, etc., all of those must be aligned to our meta theory. Okay? So I'm going to stop here for a while just to check if there are questions before I proceed. Maybe I can check the chat box if there's any question, no? Kasi you were actually encouraged to. Okay, wala pang mga tanong, but please feel free. Kung medyo mabilis ako masyado o hindi malinaw, please feel free to pose a question, no? But the big idea So far, I'm only talking about one big idea, the alignment of your research project to your underlying assumptions about reality and about knowing, or what we call the meta theory. No? Importante yun. Even if you don't write about it in your actual chapter, it's important that when you're doing every single stage of your research, you are conscious of your ontology and your epistemology. Okay? Sige. Any question? I'll just catch my breath and get a drink. So okay ba tayo? Sige. Feel free to ask questions, because actually what I'm talking to you about is a semester's worth. Of course, I'm just giving you an overview. So I'm really simplifying it a little bit. No? Okay. So what would an Ignatian meta theory look like or sound like? Again, as I said, it doesn't have to be religious, di ba? You don't have to talk about God. Oh, God exists. Hindi ganon, hindi yun ang kwento, no? Ang importante rito, what are our assumptions about reality and knowing? So there are certain meta theories that are compatible with an Ignatian worldview. There are also worldviews or meta theories that are not compatible with Ignatian worldview. Actually, more important than whether your assumptions are compatible with the Ignatian worldview, more important than that is whether you are consistent in your research work. No? Kasi if you want to, if you're subscribing to a particular meta theory, kailangan consistent ka at aligned lahat ng ginagawa mo dun sa meta theory na yon. No? Now, one meta theory that I feel is quite compatible with Ignatian worldview is called critical realism. No? And for this, I'm drawing from two books, no? Two actually seminal works that are very prevalent today, especially in Europe, no? In the UK especially. No? The first one is called The Possibility of Critical Naturalism by Roy Bhaskar, the late Roy Bhaskar. He's a philosopher of the sciences. And the second one is a realist social theory by Margaret Archer, who is based in the University of Warwick. No? And she's also a well-known social scientist. And in fact, she was the president of the Pontifical Society for the Social Sciences for a while. No? So I'm going to be drawing a lot from their work, but basically their work can be summarized in a category called critical realism. No? Critical realism. Although there are many different kinds of critical realism. Okay. So basically, when we talk about science, whether it's physical sciences, natural sciences, or social sciences, no, there are two basic functions. The first is we want to describe phenomenon. No? We want to be able to describe ano ba nangyayari, ano tong phenomenon na to, whether it's the black hole, or whether it's climate change, or whether it's poverty, no? Or whether it's social media, whatever's going on in social media. Whatever type of phenomenon it is, as a scientist, you want to be able to describe it. No? Okay. Secondly, you want to be able to explain it. And by explaining it, I'm talking about what are the causes. No? What are the causes that lead to that particular phenomenon? So for my talk today, I'm going to limit my talk to two concepts in critical realism, which I think are very important, which will give you a taste of what our meta theory, what an Ignatian meta theory should look like or sound like. The first concept is going to be very helpful when we're describing phenomenon. No? So emergence, that's the concept. I'll explain to you what emergence means as simply as I can. The second one, when we're explaining a phenomenon, ano mga causes nito, ano ba mga factors that lead to this, and I think many of our research projects have to do not only with describing, but also explaining, no, what leads to climate change, what leads to that, mga ganun, no? The concept I want to explain to you is open system. And some of you may be familiar with this already. No? Okay, so the first one, let's focus on description. No? Any empirical science, no? Whether it's physical, natural, biological, or social, no? Its basic function is to describe phenomenon. No? It should be able to describe phenomenon. And for this, I'd like to focus on the concept of emergence. But before that, let's distinguish between physical reality and social reality. You know? So if you're a physical scientist or natural scientist, obviously, your objects of investigation will be physical phenomena or physical reality. If you're a social scientist or a human scientist, like a psychologist, no? Obviously, your object of investigation will be social reality or social phenomena. What are some examples? Physical reality, rocks. So pag geologist ka, yan ang aaralin mo, di ba? trees, if you're a botanist or a biologist, di ba? Animals, zoologists and biologists. Gravity, ayan, physicists, di ba? Atoms, physicists and galaxies, physicists or astronomer, di ba? COVID-19, that's obviously a physical phenomenon, also in virus. No? So those are very legitimate objects of investigation. Di ba? And some of you may be actually studying phenomena like that. These are physical phenomena. But of course, there are also social phenomena, which are very different from physical phenomena. No? So society in general, that's a social phenomenon. No? Poverty, education, economy, government, these are very common examples of social phenomena. What's the difference between the two? First of all, what do they have in common? Both of them are socially defined. No? In short, whatever we say about rocks, trees, animals, gravity, atoms, galaxies, or education, economy, whether physical or social, we obviously define them socially because after all, knowledge is a social activity, di ba? But the difference between the two is that social reality is socially produced. In short, we need people for there to be social reality. Kung walang tao, kung walang lipunan, walang society, walang poverty, walang education, walang economy, walang government. Compare that to physical reality. Kahit na walang tao, may bato pa rin, may puno pa rin, may gravity pa rin, may atoms pa rin. May COVID-19 virus pa rin, pero walang taong naapektuhan. So that's the difference between the two. Okay? Okay, there are some questions in the chat box, but I will attend to them later, okay? So that's the difference between physical reality or physical phenomenon and social phenomenon. So at this point, I think what's going to be helpful for you is to think about your field, your discipline, and ask yourself if you already have a topic or if you're thinking or toying with the idea of a topic, ano yung topic nyo? No? Can you just type it up in the chat box just to give me an idea of some of the parang research interests that you have, no? Ano yung mga topics sa palagay nyo, pag-uusapan nyo o pag-iisipan nyo when you submit your proposal? Or if you've already done it, or if you're already starting, what is your topic? What is the phenomenon that you are studying? It may be a physical phenomenon. It may be a social phenomenon. So may I ask you to please very quickly just type on in the chat box just to give me an idea lang kung ano mga pinag-iisipan nyo, ano mga interest nyo. Okay? So let's do that. Okay, Filipino crisis leadership, clearly a social phenomenon, very interesting. No? Thank you, Melissa. Can we hear from the others? Or kahit hindi pa kayo sigurado, parang kasi you have not submitted your proposal, but something you might actually do. The Catholic Church's identity in the Philippine politics, okay, very, very interesting also. Obviously a social phenomenon. Discovering the Catholic faith in the anime worldview, very interesting. No? I don't know what you'll discover, but okay. Augustinian pedagogy, okay. Okay. So karamihan dito actually are social phenomena, no? Karamihan dito, no? Okay? Yeah. A lot of the dito integration of Catholic teaching in mathematics. Oh, that's very interesting. I don't know what you mean, no? But it sounds like a very interesting combination, mathematics and Catholic teaching, no? Medical doctors in residency, training, engagement in learning, social phenomenon. So karamihan ng inyong, so far, I think everything I've seen are social phenomena. Positive parenting programs, social phenomenon. Meron bang physical or natural phenomenon? Meron bang, may mga SOSE dito, di ba? Ano yung mga ano nyo, mga topics nyo? Meron ba kayong parang social, physical phenomenon? Of course, sometimes it's a combination of both, di ba? For example, medical doctors in residency training, that's actually more social, no? Thinking routines is social, gendered impacts of sand mining on coastal communities. Wow, you have very interesting research interests. I'm excited about what you guys will come up with. No, but basically, okay. So that gives me an idea. Karamihan sa inyo mas social phenomenon. No, okay. So So I want to focus on emergence. No, since karamihan sa mga topics nyo social, no, social reality, then all the more emergence becomes a very crucial concept. No. And it will help you define your object of investigation. No? So, what do I mean? No? The first thing I want to reject at the outset is if you subscribe to emergence, if you subscribe to critical realism, if you want your research to be compatible with the Ignatian worldview, you must reject reductionism. Okay? What's reductionism? This is an example. Society is society is nothing but the sum of people living together. No? So emergence, to reject reductionism means you should say that society is not nothing but the sum of people living together. No? Because reductionism will say, if I want to study society, all I have to do is study the individuals. No? So whatever happens in society is nothing but the sum total of the individual decisions and actions of people. No? Now, emergence is against that. Emergence is saying you cannot study society by studying the components of society alone. No? You cannot understand society or define society by just focusing on the individuals. For example, Philippine society, I will only focus on Filipinos. No? Hindi, no? Something else is going on in Philippine society that is different from individuals. That's what emergence means. No? So let me define for you what emergence means. No? Emergence believes that new and more complex entities with their own particular properties and causal powers emerge from a unique combination of more basic entities. Medyo nosebleed ang definition, but I'll unpack it for you. What does it mean? Let's go back to society and people. No? In other words, when the Philippine society emerges, no, Philippine society has its own properties and causal powers, no, that result from the unique combination of the more basic entities, in this case, the individuals in Philippine society. No? So ang sinasabi dito, dahil nagsama-sama ang mga Pilipino sa isang lugar, no? At hindi lang yun, hindi lang dahil nagsama-sama, dahil meron silang mga tungkulin na ginagampanan. We have government leaders, we have citizens, we have teachers, we have students, no? We have Duterte fanatics, we have yellow tarts, and so on and so forth. All these roles, all these relationships that's going on, no? What happens is that something new emerges, a more complex entity that you cannot reduce to the individual Filipinos. No? No? There's something else going on the level of Philippine society that has its own particular properties, which are not the same as the properties of individual Filipinos. No? And Philippine society as a whole has a causal power that is more than the sum of the causes, the causal powers of people. No? It's not just like stereotyping. No? It means you're not reducing society to its components. No? Let me give you an example. Here is a very simple example. No? I think all of us know that water is made up of two molecules of hydrogen and one molecule of oxygen. No? So what we're saying here is water is emergent from the hydrogen and oxygen molecules. No? Water is not the same as hydrogen and oxygen, no? Because you have two molecules of hydrogen that combine with oxygen. There's a special relationship between the two. You end up with water. No? Hydrogen and oxygen are not wet, but water is wet. No? May property ang tubig na wala sa hydrogen at oxygen. Lumalabas yung property na yon dahil may special combination ang hydrogen and oxygen. Water is rooted in hydrogen and oxygen, but is emergent from and cannot be reduced to the hydrogen and oxygen molecules. No? Water can cause effects, no, that hydrogen and oxygen cannot. For example, water can get you wet. Water can move things around. Water can be a source of energy. No? So that special combination, something else emerges. Okay. Another example, computer. No? Computer is made of plastic, metal, silicon, and electricity. But not just any plastic, metal, silicon, electricity. If I go to a garbage dump na merong plastic, metal, silicon, electricity, I don't have a computer. There should be a special relationship, special combination of the plastic, metal, silicon, electricity. Diba? And then from that emerges computer. And the computer has properties that you cannot find in plastic, metal, silicon, electricity. No? It's a special combination of these raw materials that give computer its special computing powers. No? And computers can do a lot of things, can make a lot of difference in a way that plastic, metal, silicon, electricity cannot. No? So what we're saying here is that according to the concept of emergence, there is something else that's real in the complex entity. No? So in short, what we're saying here is if you're doing research on water or on computer, you cannot just study the elements. You have to study water itself, and you have to study computer itself also. No? in the same way, if we apply that to society, because that's a more parang relatable, ano, di ba? A lot of your topics are social reality, social phenomena. Ano? For example, gendered identity. That's a social phenomenon, di ba? So gendered identity is not just the different attitudes of people, no? That belief, that ideology, okay, there's something else there that warrants investigation. No? So society or social structures, okay, or other social phenomena are rooted in people, because without people, you can't have all these social realities. No? Isa-isa yun natin mga topics yun. Thinking routines. You can't have thinking routines if you don't have people. No? Positive parenting. If you don't have people, you cannot have positive parenting. No? Learning autonomy. You can, or motivation. You cannot. You cannot have that, no, without people. No? So all these social phenomena are rooted in people, but they are emergent from people, and there's something irreducible about them. In short, you have to study that social phenomenon on its own, but also taking into consideration its components, no, the people who are involved, no, but you cannot reduce it to the people involved. What do I mean by that? Let's take an example. For example, let's look at some of your examples. Okay, conflict talk in social media, for example, diba? Let's say you want to study that, no? Obviously, without social media users, you cannot have conflict talk, diba? But you cannot have that phenomenon that, oh, no one's gonna talk, no one's gonna be in conflict without people, no? So obviously, you have to study the users, diba? The social media users. That's why you have to survey them. But conflict talk in social media isn't just the people who are using social media. Something else about social media, the structure of social media, the culture in social media, there's something there that causes a particular way of conflict talk in social media. So as a researcher, you cannot reduce your investigation only to what your users are doing. Kasi yung mga sinurvey ko, ganito sila eh. No? Hindi gano'n, no? You have to study also the structure, the culture in social media that you cannot reduce to the individual social media users. And that's where the theorizing come in. No? You must define conflict talk not only based on the individual social media users, you must explain conflict talk in social media not only based on the decisions and actions of the individual social media users, but also about the very structure that's found in social media. That's what emergence means, basically. Okay, so emergence means that you can actually have a hierarchy of causes. No, there are higher order causes or more complex causes, and there are lower order causes or more basic or simpler causes. No? So of course, the basic is physical and chemical. No, for example, if you want to study motivation, motivation is primarily what kind of cause or what kind of phenomenon, what level. It would be socio-psychological. It would be the top two, no? But without biological, without the body of people, it will not happen, no? In short, when we're studying motivation, we have to be focused on the social psychological, but also take into consideration the biological and physical, no? Now, compare this to a positivist, no? A positivist would reduce everything to what is measurable or observable. So he will say, a positivist will say that motivation is nothing but the biological and physical and chemical processes in our brain. Parang ganon, di ba? And if you are into that, if you're a reductionist or positivist, positivists are reductionists because they reduce phenomenon to its observable and measurable components only. If you're a positivist or reductionist, that's not Ignatian. Ignatian would acknowledge the emergent realities, no, that they are real by their own right, and they are also causal in their own right. Okay, so let me just go on with emergence. So emergent irreducibility, in other words, you cannot reduce the higher level or complex entities to their components. No? The higher causes are not completely determined or explained by the lower causes. While they remain subject to the laws of their nature at the lower level, their properties are distinct and irreducible. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that we're acknowledging that the more complex causes, the more complex phenomena are dependent on the more basic ones, but they are not completely determined or explained by them. No? What do I mean by this? Let me give you an example. Learning, for example. Learning is a complex phenomenon, di ba? it entails the social and the psychological. But it is subject to the laws of our bodies, no? Kung gutom tayo, kung pagod tayo, kung inaantok tayo, it will affect the learning, di ba? So it shows you that as far as this hierarchy of causes is concerned, the biological and physical and chemical affect the social and psychological, no? The social and psychological, in this case learning, our capacity to learn, is vulnerable to the laws of biology and physics and chemistry, no? But the point we're trying to make here is if we believe in emergence, they are not completely determined or explained by the lower causes. In short, even if apektado ang ating capacity for learning and our desire for learning by our appetite, our exhaustion, whatever, our physical bodies, no, we are not completely determined by that. No? It is possible by sheer free will for a person, kahit na gutom, kahit na pagod, kahit na inaantok, to be able to learn, no? Although with difficulty. That shows us that the social and psychological are not completely defined or determined by the biological and physical and chemical. In short, we're into emergence. We're against reductionism. A reductionist will say learning is nothing but the biological, physical, and chemical. So as you can see, this particular assumption about reality, no, emergence, is going to affect the way you define your phenomenon and the way you study your phenomenon. No? So each level is irreducible. No? You cannot reduce the social just to the physical. Each level is causal. No? They can have an effect. No? So for example, your free will is a higher cause. No? It's a higher social-psychological phenomenon. It can make a difference. Kahit na gutom ka, it can make a difference. No? You can actually, out of free will, still do something about it. No? And each level is real. And if each level is real, it is worthy of investigation or study. No? So here's one principle to wrap up what I'm talking about in emergence. No? The nature of an object determines its cognitive possibility and defines the science proper to it. This is from Roy Bhaskar. It's a very dense statement, but basically what it means is that for us to be able to know, no, a particular object, it depends on its nature. So is it a physical object? Is it a chemical object? Is it a biological object? Is it a psychological or social phenomenon? Or is it all of the above? Because a human person is all of the above. We are social beings. We are also psychological, physical, biological, chemical. Diba? So all of the above yan. No? So that means that if we want to study a complex entity or phenomenon, we have to look at the sciences. That's why interdisciplinarity is important. No? Because the hierarchy of causes gives rise to a similar hierarchy of sciences. No? So pag physical phenomenon pinag-aralan mo, physics yan, obviously, chemistry, biology. But pag human being na, psychology na, pero meron ding physics, chemistry, biology, at kung social reality na, meron ding psychology, meron ding physics, chemistry, biology, but it's primarily social science. Okay? So the second big idea of this talk is emergence, no? That we should reject reductionism. So one meta-theory that is compatible with an Ignatian approach is one that rejects reductionism and recognizes emergence. Okay? So I'm going to stop here because baka medyo nahihilo na kayo kasi medyo minadali ko ng konti. Are there questions, no, about emergence, which is our second big idea? And I will wrap up with a third big idea, and that's it for the day. No? Sige, may mga tanong ba tayo? I don't know if there are some things in the chat.
Father, I've been moderating the chat box, and so far po, there are two groups of questions. Prior to your discussion on the emergence, I'd like to bring up two questions given by Ms. Carolina Martin and Mr. Mark Quizon. So for the first question, for us to be able to realize, understand, or explain the phenomenon, would it be helpful to start with a questionnaire? So I think this is with regards to methodology. And then the second question is, how about analyzing fictional narratives and literatures to deepen one's perception about faith? Is it possible to use it for thesis or research?
Okay, parang nag-nosebleed ako doon. Yung unang tanong, nakalimutan ko yung first
question. The first question po, Father, is for us to be able to realize, understand, or explain the phenomenon, would it be helpful to start with a questionnaire?
Okay, this is from Carolina, di ba?
Yes.
What is Carolina's topic? I think it's, What's her topic? Para lang
It's about medical doctors in residency training, engagement in learning.
Okay, so engagement in learning. So that seems to be your main di ba, phenomenon that you want to study the learning, no? Ano uli yun?
Medical doctors in residency training, engagement in learning.
So engagement in learning, that's the main phenomenon you want to study. The context or the specific context is medical doctors in training. Okay, so your question is, can you use a questionnaire? Even before you use a questionnaire, it's good to ask yourself, engagement in learning, what does that look like? What is that? No? When you talk about the hierarchy of entities or phenomena, obviously it's a social-psychological phenomenon, di ba? So immediately you'll be able to say na your main topic, the phenomenon you want to study, will have a social component, will have a psychological component, but will also have the physical, biological component. So it's a complex phenomenon. You don't need a questionnaire to find that out. In your lit review, if your concept's a little bit more complicated, your lit review should also reveal in terms of the components of the reality you're studying. No? What the questionnaire will do, basically, is reveal to you what the conceptions of the respondents are. No? They will tell you their opinion, no? Which is valuable, but it will not answer the question, what kind of phenomenon are we looking at? No? So medyo related to sa previous example ko eh. In short, if you're going to, engagement in learning kasi is affected by the physical and chemical, di ba? So if for you, it's all about, if you reduce engagement in learning only to the physical state of the person, for example, the only factors that lead to higher engagement are physical and biological, medyo reductionist yon, no? You must also look for social and psychological variables, no? So as you can see, if you're a reductionist, medyo makitid na yung approach mo because you're only going to look for physical and chemical and biological factors or causes. But if you subscribe to emergence, you will be on the lookout for social and psychological. And a questionnaire is one way of doing that. But a questionnaire can also tell you, can also relate to you physical and chemical biological causes, di ba? Halimbawa, pag gutom ba kayo, nakaka-engage kayo, siguro ang sagot nun, hindi, di ba? Parang ganon. So, but the other thing I want to say is that even the decision to use a questionnaire will depend on your understanding or conception of what you're studying, no? Because a questionnaire is not always going to be effective, even if what you're studying is a social phenomenon. No? Kasi if a questionnaire is valuable if the self-reports are important. No? For example, I will report about my own engagement in learning. Diba? If that's not, in this case, I think it's important. But if it's not important, you don't need a questionnaire. Maybe you should do observation. I don't know. No? Parang ganon, diba? So even your choice of method depends on your understanding of the phenomenon you're studying. No? Kaya importante na maging mulat tayo sa ating ontology, sa ating underlying assumptions about reality, and to check whether we subscribe to emergence or if we're guilty of the mortal sin of reductionism. Okay? Sige, what's the other question?
Thank you, Father. For the second question po, it's from Mr. Mark Quizon. Upon review of the chat box, his topic is on discovering the Catholic faith in the anime worldview. And his question is, how about analyzing fictional narratives and literatures to deepen one's perception about faith? Is possible to use it for thesis or research? So yung topic po niya, Father, is discovering the Catholic faith in the anime worldview.
Okay, I think as a subject, it's not a topic, no, it's a subject. Yeah. As a subject, it's interesting, but you have to focus it further. What do you mean by discovering the Catholic faith? Are you saying that can the anime narratives fiction be used as a material for teaching the Catholic faith, or are you saying that can readers of anime fiction be able to interpret whatever is there? I'm not familiar with anime, no? Whatever is there, so that one can reflect on one's faith. So it depends on how you focus the topic, no? But certainly it's a very interesting subject area, especially because anime is so popular today. But I think the challenge at this point, given where you are, or at least the way you formulated your topic, is that it needs to be further revised. No? But going back to emergence, fictional narratives, anime, obviously these are social psychological parang phenomenon, no? And so obviously it's important. Ang ano kasi sa literature, ang interesting sa literature is you're going to analyze the parang three components. The text itself, the text of the anime, the reader, and the author. No? Kasi you cannot reduce the meaning of the text to the intention of the author or to the interpretation of the reader, di ba? So pag emergence, if you subscribe to emergence, you have to look at all three, no? Because the meaning of a text cannot be reduced to the text itself, or cannot be reduced to only the author's intention or to only the reader's interpretation. It's a dialogue among the three. No? So reductionism would just say, ayokong tingnan ang titingnan ko lang yung author's intention lang. Or yung reader's interpretation lang. Mali yun. You have to look at all three, no? And the interaction among the three. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Father. Actually, he responded in the chat. Before I give I show the other questions, ito ping reply niya, can be used for teaching Catholic faith, reflect on the faith. Yun pa yung reply niya.
Yes. Well, okay. Well, that's a very, very practical and very good question for teachers, especially I'm into religious education. So I would be very interested in what you find. No? But if it's going to be an academic or intellectual work, so you have to have a theoretical framework. Eh? And in this particular case, I think it may have to be a kind of hermeneutic, parang a theory of interpretation. No? And you have to use that to sort of, so what you're doing actually is a philosophical. Well, you have two choices. One is you can do a philosophical work and just sort of study the possibility, no, in principle of using anime fiction for teaching or reflecting on your faith, no? Or it can be empirical. You can actually, like interview people who are using it or make people use it and find out how they do it. Parang ganon, di ba? But it's important to have a theoretical framework. So in this case, it may have to be something about hermeneutics. I think how we interpret text in general, no? and then see whether that applies, no, to your research project. But I think you need to, maybe fine tune it a bit more. And I think you need to look for a theoretical framework para mas sounding intellectual yung research mo, di ba? Parang ganon. Although I guess it's okay to do an evaluation. I guess it's okay. Yeah. Okay, maybe one more question before I proceed because I have another big idea.
Father, there's one from Angelo Perez. How does the concept of emergence relate to more complex phenomena that are not just either physical or social, i.e. those that can have physical and social components? I'm thinking of phenomena such as climate change and even COVID-19.
No, that's a very good question. No? I thought it's Ajay pa to.
From Angelo Perez po.
Yes, Father.
Okay, so I knew it.
Hello, Father.
So, if I go back to this, I don't know. I just want to, thanks for that question, which helps me clarify. No? If a phenomenon is social, it is automatically psychological, biological, physical, chemical. So climate change, COVID-19 is all of the above. No? So as you go up the hierarchy, it becomes more complex because it's not just one level. It's several levels. So for example, COVID-19 actually is a social-psychological phenomenon na rin, no? So it's actually because of the pandemic. So it has the social, psychological, biological, physical, and chemical. So your question is right on because it's really all of the above. So a more complex entity or phenomenon usually has several levels, not just one. No? And if you want an exhaust, depending on your angle or topic, but your research will have to include at least mention the other levels, although you may want to focus on one. For example, if you say depression in the time of COVID-19, then that's more psychological, social, no? Or if it's more about the actual virus, obviously it's more biological, physical, and chemical. But it's all of the above, no? So I think a more valuable research should acknowledge that COVID-19 and climate change are really complex phenomena that have several levels. Okay, I hope that's helpful, Ajay. Okay, so if you may, I think we have 30 minutes left, but I just want to very quickly go to the third big idea. So the first big idea is it's important to be conscious of your meta theory. so that there's alignment and consistency, no? And if it's compatible with Ignatian worldview, even better. But that's not the most important thing. Even if you don't care about Ignatian worldview, that's fine. But at least you have to be consistent and aligned in your research. Diba? The second big idea is when we're defining phenomenon and studying phenomenon, no, emergence is an important concept because we don't want to be reductionist. No? Okay, so maybe just very quickly, let me wrap that up. No, reductionism goes both ways. No, society is not nothing but a group of people living together, but neither are people nothing but the product of social conditions. No, in short, we are not just the absolutely determined by social conditions. That's the other form of reductionism. No? So there's a concept called dual or multiple control where it says, babasahin ko lang but I'll explain it. The higher order causes are not absolutely determined by the more basic causes. Alam natin yan. But the second part is the higher order causes are capable of acting back on the lower order causes. They also have causal power over them. The example I gave earlier fits this. No? For example, to learn when we're hungry or sleepy or exhausted. No? Even if we are affected by our hunger, our sleepiness, our exhaustion, no? So the higher order causes are affected by the lower order causes, no? We can act back. No? We can say by my sheer willpower or maybe my fear of my teacher, I'm going to study. No? And I'm going to learn pa rin. Kahit nagutom ako, inaantok ako, o pagod ako. Okay? So that shows you that the higher order causes, the social and psychological, can also act back. No? So we are not completely determined by the lower level causes. No? So here what we're saying is we are actually rejecting determinism. No? We're actually determinism means there's no free will. We're all affected. We're all already shaped by the lower order causes. Para tayong physical laws lang. So natural, biological, and social causes provide us with possibilities and limits, but do not determine our behavior. No? So just because gutom ako, just because may peer pressure, ibig sabihin automatically yun ang mangyayari. No? We can enable or constrain the operations of the physical, biological, and social causes that we are subject to. No? So our example again is kahit na may pressure from our bodies not to learn, not to study, no, it's actually possible for us to act back and control it, parang ganon, no. So we are not completely determined by the lower level causes. So the second Ignatian big idea is freedom, no. Freedom. We are not just determined by our bodies. We are not just determined by our past, no. We can act back. We can transcend, no. So that's actually a very philosophical and spiritual concept, but it also applies to the natural world, no? And that brings me to the second big idea, the second concept of the open system. No? We said earlier that in science, when we describe, it's important for us to be at least clear, are we going for emergence or reductionism? No? When we're explaining already, we have to ask ourselves, do we believe in the open system? No? The open system is another important concept, and I want to explain it to you. This is especially important for the social sciences, but it's also true for the physical sciences. No. Okay, so in the physical sciences, when we go to the laboratory, what we're doing is, what the scientist does really is the scientist closes the system. The system is not open. What do we mean by closing the system? We control the extraneous variable. No? This is what scientists call experimental control. Diba? So event 1 leads to event 2 because the cause is operating because there are no other causes getting in the way. No? So for example, no, if I add salt to water, no, the boiling degree, the boiling temperature will go up. No? Now, event 1 is adding salt to water. Event 2 is the boiling degree goes up. That's event 1, that's event 2. The cause is the molecules. No? The molecules of the water, somehow it has a tendency to react with salt or any other object you add to the water so that the temperature goes higher. That's the cause. It's not adding salt to water. Adding salt to water is the condition, no? Which I'll explain later. No? That's the closed system because nothing else is affecting the water, only the salt. So you're able to close the system and control the variable and see the effect. Diba? Now, in the world outside the laboratory, it's not a closed system, it's an open system. And look at this diagram carefully. You know? In an open system, you have several causes acting at the same time. No? So for example, in the laboratory, if there's only one cause, event 1 will lead to event 2, but in the world outside, the other causes will interact with that one cause. Halo-halo yan. So iba-iba yung lumalabas na event. Minsan nakaka-cancel out yung event, no? Hindi tumataas yung boiling temperature, but something else happens, no? So that's what real life is, di ba? Magulo sa labas. That's why we need to experiment and go to the laboratory, no? Okay, so in short, this is actually Hume, no? This is the what people always say na if you're talking about causes, do not mistake causes for correlation, no? Kasi yan ang pagkakamali dati ng mga scientists, no? That just because event A accompanies event event X, they mistake event A as the cause. When in fact, that's called correlation. Sabay silang nagaganap. Madalas silang magkasama. That's only correlation, no? Event A is not the cause, no? If pag magkasama sila, most probably event A is only a condition, no? So you have to look for the cause, and not only one cause, but several causes. Especially if you're doing a social a science, if your research project is social science, because in social science it's an open system. No? There are many causes. Remember we said, no, hindi lang social, may psychological, meron pang physical, chemical, tsaka biological. Example, engagement in learning among medical students. Certainly one possible cause is exhaustion. Masyado maraming trabaho, pagod na yung mga doktor, no? In their training, no? Secondly, maybe pressure from their teachers. That would be a social factor, no? Third, their own intelligence, siguro, di ba? Their own desire to be a doctor. So, maraming causes yan at naghahalo-halo yan for the effect. So, as a social scientist, you cannot just enumerate. First of all, there are two mortal sins, no? If you're the researcher doing that study. The first is you will say, kasi pagod sila, they can't study. You're reducing. Reductionism, no? The second thing is you only focus on one factor. You're not acknowledging that there are many different factors interacting with one another. So a very good study of engagement in learning among medical students in training is for you to be able to come up with a narrative on how these different causes interact with one another. And hopefully that you come up with a theory based on how these causes interact with one another. Okay, so it's a very challenging work, no, in terms of theory, no. Okay, so this is very important, no. We have to redefine what causation is, no. Causation is not empirical determination. It doesn't mean that the effect is certainly going to happen. We're not sure it's going to happen because in the open system, other causes get in the way, no. So causation means necessity without determination, no. That all things equal, it's going to happen. But we are not determining the event kasi there are other causes in the open system, no? So causal laws are about tendencies of acting in the open system which may or may not be realized in any sort of outcome. Let me give you an example. Kapag gutom ka, most probably your tendency is not to learn. Okay? It doesn't mean you're not going to learn. Just because gutom ka, hindi ibig sabihin automatically forever hindi ka na matututo. Ibig sabihin nun, mas mahirap matuto, pero pwede pa rin. Kasi if another cause, your own free will is a cause, no? If you decide out of sheer free will to overcome your hunger to be able to learn, you are going to learn. No? So the causal law is hunger inhibits learning, no? But it doesn't determine an event. It doesn't determine the effect. It only says that's the tendency. It's harder to learn if you are hungry, tired, or sick, basically. Parang ganon. So tendency lang siya. So when you're coming up with your theories, when you're explaining something, remember the word tendency. No, you cannot say automatically this is going to happen. That sounds very academically primitive and intellectually naive. No, you have to acknowledge the open system that in the real world, other factors get in the way. So if your study can also account for the other factors, the other causes, no, then I think it's going to be a better study. Okay? So here's a very good metaphor. It's like a game of chess. Causality is like the game of chess. Outside the domain of closure, in other words, in the real world, where there's an open system, laws or theories are like the rules of chess. The play is seldom determined, but no one breaks the law. That's a very good quotation. I like this quotation very much. No? For example, if your theory is hunger inhibits learning, no, that particular law or theory does not determine the outcome, does not determine the play, just like in chess. No? But nobody breaks that rule. When I'm hungry, it's harder to learn. I'm still following the law, no? But it does not determine the outcome. So what's the bottom line here? We have to reject determinism. In fact, related to that, we have to reject prediction. You cannot predict outside the laboratory. No? You can say that these are the tendencies, but you cannot predict. No? And that's a good topic for another discussion. Okay, so necessity without determination means causal laws define possibilities and limits of how things act in the world, but they do not dictate their outcomes. So, for example, hunger inhibits learning. It defines a limit, but it does not determine or dictate the outcome. No? I can still learn because there are other causes that might, at least interact with my hunger and overcome the hunger. Okay, so just my final slides. So the big idea here is, if you want an Ignatian approach to your research, a worldview or meta theory compatible with the Ignatian worldview, you must at the very least reject reductionism, no, in your study, and also reject determinism. No? In short, you must go for emergence and you must acknowledge open system. No? And if you want to look at the process of research, no, your meta theory is the basis for everything else. Even your choice of subject, no, whether it warrants your investigation, if it's a real phenomenon that's worth studying, that depends on your meta theory. So, for example, motivation. If you're a reductionist, motivation is not worth studying. You should study the people, the brains of the people, the chemical imbalances in those people, and the neural activity. No. So you don't study motivation. You don't study engagement. No? So again, you can see your ontology and your epistemology affects your choice of subject. It also affects your choice of topic, your research question, how you will focus the subject. No? Your theoretical framework and your lit review, this will really come up with this is where you gather all the concepts and definitions and theories. Diba? Again, this will be dependent on your meta theory. No? Your methodology, your analysis, your choice of whether are you going to go survey, are you using experiment? All of that will depend also on your ontology and epistemology. And finally, your conclusion, whether you are confirming your theory in your theoretical framework, you're revising it, or you're replacing it, that also depends on your assumptions about reality and your assumptions about knowing. No? So, ang third big idea ko is that if you're explaining a phenomenon, especially if it's a social phenomenon, but even if it's a natural or physical phenomenon, it's important for you to be conscious of your assumptions about reality, no? That all these phenomena are found in an open system where every cause interacts with other causes. So your explanation cannot just be limited to one cause. No? It must acknowledge the other causes. And at the same time, the science you draw from cannot be only one. It has to be interdisciplinary. Maybe one science will play a more important role because that's the focus of your research. Maybe psychology is more important in a study about motivation or engagement. No? But it must acknowledge the other sciences as well. You must know something about the physiological factors that affect learning. And you must somehow mention that also in your explanation. Okay? So that's all I have. I don't know if that made sense, but basically there are three big ideas. The first is be explicit about your ontology and your epistemology, because your meta theory, everything you do in your research must be aligned to your meta theory. No? In fact, as a research supervisor or somebody who joins the panel in the defense, I'm looking for misalignments all the time. No? And they're often found. Kasi nga hindi conscious yung bata, no? Yung student. Number two, when we're describing phenomenon, it's important for us to subscribe to emergence, that we are not guilty of reductionism. And third, when we're explaining the causes, no, it's important to acknowledge the open system of the world, especially if it's a social phenomenon, but also if it's physical, because even a physical phenomenon you cannot predict because other causes get in the way. That's all I have. I hope I did not give you a headache. I hope it was clear, and anyway, it's recorded. So, and I'll share my slides with Doc Candelaria for those who want to access them. That's all I have. I think we have a few minutes lang for questions. So please feel free to ask questions. And the more specific your questions are to your research project, I think the better.
Thank you so much, Father. Again, to all my fellow graduate students joining this lecture today, please feel free to input any questions, concerns, or queries you may have in the chat box, and we are closely monitoring it. So while we're waiting for the questions, Father, I'd like to go back to some points for clarification that were raised earlier. It's from Ed Bulilan and again, Mr. Mark Quizon. It's regarding your discussion on emergence. I think these are questions that are closely related, and they would like to clarify your definition or discussion on emergence. From Mr. Ed Bulilan, he asked, is it like examining phenomena more than its elements or variables, but considering largely the relationship between these elements? And from Mr. Quizon, so therefore we need to investigate both the components at the same time the sum of its components. So I think these two questions are closely related.
Yes, yes. Well, those are very good questions. So yes, more or less. But the main point there is that you are acknowledging that the more complex phenomenon is real and worthy of investigation. No? And of course, you have to take into consideration the components. But there's something else going on the level of the more complex phenomenon. Maybe for some of you, parang ang obvious naman, ano pinagsasabi ni Father, no? But it's an ongoing debate, and there's always a tendency to go reductionist. It's very tempting to be reductionist in our research work because it's simpler. No? It's easier to be a reductionist. Kasi for example, motivation or engagement in learning, ano ba? Positive parenting. It's easier to reduce all that to something measurable and observable. No? So it's more challenging to acknowledge that there's something else going on here that you cannot see merely by studying the elements. No? So ang challenge is not so much studying the elements, but studying the phenomenon itself for what it is on that level in all its complexity. No? So magandang tanong because it draws our attention to the need to consider the components, but the main point here is don't just stay with the components. You must study what you have to try to understand is not just the components, but the phenomenon itself. Your theory should be about the phenomenon itself. And the phenomenon should not just say motivation is equal to the components, because the more complex phenomenon is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just the sum of its parts. Emergence means it's more than just the sum of its parts. And your job as a researcher is to find that out. What is that something more that's going on? I think that's one good way of summarizing the research enterprise. What is that something more going on this basic on this complex phenomenon I'm studying that are not obvious in the components? Yun. I hope that's helpful.
Hello po, Father Johnny. This is Ed Bulilan po. I have a question lang po. Kasi, for example po, my research, I'm interested in studying po identity, for example, identity of the Catholic Church or having the identity of the Filipino using a more historical approach, particularly po yung discourse historical approach by Wodak. So she's a social scientist po. And personally, ang aking pong meta theory is more on, I believe na yung phenomena are socially constructed, but I also believe that there are structures that are consistent throughout time. So can we say that the critical realism po ba na meta theory is like in the middle of this positivism and social constructionism?
What's the positivism there? I can see the social constructionism, but what's the positivism in your example? Can you clarify?
For example, Father, yung sa Filipino identity, parang Filipino identity can differ through time po, di ba? So, depende po kung yung nangyayari. Pero, I believe na meron ding mga identity na remains even though napabago-bago po yung panahon.
Parang hindi siya positivist. That's not positivist. That's quite, okay, social constructionism, no? Or social constructivism. That's the most popular meta theory today. But the extreme of social constructivism is everything is constructed, which is what you're avoiding, right?
Yes, Father.
So actually, critical realist yung approach mo, yung meta theory mo, because critical realism, if you remember a previous slide I showed, social reality is socially defined no, and socially produced. But the thing there is that it is independent of the knower. So something remains, di ba?
Yes, Father.
Independent. So actually, medyo compatible with Ignatian worldview yung pinapahiwatig mo. I think critical realism would be a good conceptual toolbox for you as you do this study.
Okay po. Thank you, Father.
So I like that example. So to talk about Filipino identity or the identity of the Catholic Church. Oh, which of the two, by the way? Alin dun sa dalawa?
Actually, Father, I'm still deciding po kung ano dun. Kasi when I consulted some of my professors about Filipino identity, parang he told me na, but there are already studies in sociology telling nga na there's no such thing as national identity kasi nga it changes daw talaga. Then combination of ano.
Just because something changes doesn't mean it doesn't
exist. Yun nga po,
Father.
So yung second concern ko, Father, is I think it's also important for us students to find a teacher or advisor who also has the same meta theory or understanding of reality or ontology epistemology po, no?
So I think what's important, what's more crucial is you can have that conversation with your supervisor.
Yes,
to talk about your assumptions, diba? But I just want to go back to what you said about a reality changing, no? But all social realities change.
Yes po.
Diba? Motivation change, everything changes. Pag people, because they're socially produced, they will change, no? So just because it changes doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So the question is, although I can't imagine exactly how you'll do it kasi medyo malawak yung topic na Filipino identity, no? But yes, there have been a lot of studies, but it's good to mine them, I think, and to find out. That's the other thing, no? When you're doing a lit review, it's also good to sort of infer what they're to interrogate the literature for their epistemologies and ontologies. Are they compatible with yours? Because if they say it's socially constructed lang, that's only one side of the picture. Of course, Filipino identity is socially constructed, but it's not only socially constructed. It has an autonomous existence. No, I'm not saying we don't need people to have Filipino identity. I'm just saying that whatever I wish, there will be some kind of Filipino identity, whether I like it or not. Parang ganon, di ba? But yes. I think you have to find out whether there is such a thing and exactly how you're going to define it. But your meta theory will affect that, di ba? Parang ganon.
Yes, Father. Thank you po, Father Jen.
Father, there are two questions po here in the chat box. I'll begin with Miss Sienna's question. She's asking, I think this is about alignment. To avoid reductionism and determinism, does it mean po our conclusions also must imply the limits of our analysis, not only in the conclusions, but in all parts of your paper? So I think
I agree with you completely, no? Because a good I think Dr. Candelaria and the others will agree with me that one of the most basic minimum requirements we look for is intellectual humility, diba? In a research work, diba? So unless you've really found something radical revolutionary, parang it's always good to be aware of the limits of your study. So that's important, but it doesn't necessarily relate to reductionism, determinism. No? Reductionism means you're acknowledging reality. You're acknowledging more complex phenomena. That's what reductionism means, no? And you're saying that you cannot just analyze that by analyzing the parts. You have to analyze that big thing as well, no? Kasi maraming nagaganap doon, no? Otherwise, you don't need social sciences, you don't need psychology. Mag-physics lang tayo if everything can be reduced, no? Determinism means that when you're trying to explain a phenomenon, there are many factors, and you must make sure that you account for these factors, and they do not determine events all the time. They only talk about tendencies. That if you have these factors and they interact in a particular, so your theory must sound like this: if these factors are present and they're active, this is the tendency. Parang dapat ganun ang pagsagot mo, hindi yung tipong parang sigurado ka mangyayari yon, parang ganun.
Father, thank you. I think the next question from Julius is related to that with regards to scope and limitations. He's asking, hello, Father. With the current setup that we have, how do we select our respondents and how will it affect the validity of the data? I think, Father, this is in consideration with the fact that, well, for most of us, we are gathering data remotely. Given that we are researching at a very odd time during a pandemic. So I think yun po yung tanong niya, how do we select our respondents and how will that affect the validity of the data? maybe advice po that you could give to researchers pursuing studies at the time of a pandemic?
It depends on the research question, and it depends on the object of study, di ba? Di ba earlier I showed you a slide that said that parang the what do you call this, the cognitive possibility of something depends on its nature. So it depends on the object, it depends on your topic, and depends on your research question. So it's very possible to have very valid data gathered during this pandemic. No, it's very possible, but it depends really on the topic. No, maybe in principle I can imagine that some will not be, but it's very possible in principle. No? So it's not an issue. Depends on the object of the object you're studying, and depends on your topic.
Opo, Father. Thank you. For the next, perhaps you can see last two questions, maybe for this lecture. They're also related again with your discussion on rejecting reductionism. So I'll begin with Mr. Quizon's question. He's asking if the research or theory has a reductionist or determinist idea or meta theory, can we use it as one of the materials for the review of literature? And then for the next question, it's more specific from Anunciacion, Peña, Florida. I'm thinking about studying campus resilience. If I just focus on the effect of land use to campus resilience, can it be considered reductionism?
Okay, let's go to Mark's question first. No? I think you can actually interrogate a literature based on your critique of reductionism or determinism. No? So for example, if a particular research smells suspiciously of reductionism and determinism, and you want to bring that up, I think that would be a very interesting review of literature. No? Because a part of, in fact, I don't know what the other research supervisors feel, but I think one of the things lacking in lit review among Filipino students is the critiquing, the interrogation. No? And I think certainly the meta theory is a good point of contesting a lit review or exposing its limitations. No? So for example, if you find a particular theory as suspiciously infected with determinism, you can actually interrogate that and bring it up and say, this seems limited because so. I think that'll be an interesting discussion in your lit review. No? The other one's about campus resilience. If I just focus on the effect of land use. No, there's nothing wrong with focusing, as long as you always acknowledge that there will be other causes. No? So in fact, you have to focus. No? You cannot, it depends on your research question, but in this particular case, very clear it's land use. So you can sort of focus on that. No? But it's important to be clear that that's not the only thing in the real world. So I don't, to acknowledge that there are other causes. How you'll do that will depend on your topic and depend on the way you develop it as well. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Father. For now, those are the questions we have. And maybe an invitation again to our fellow graduate students. If you have any questions, if even beyond this lecture, just feel free to send them to us. We'll make sure that we can send it also to Father Johnny. So thank you again, Father, for answering our questions. Thank you, everyone.